This is the audio description for Indiana Disability Justice Task Force's webinar number 1, Historical and Cultural Context for Disability Justice and Primary Prevention. I'm Caitlin Walsh, and I will be narrating any visuals or on-screen text that are not covered by the speaker. Links mentioned will be included in video notes.
So first off, I just want to give people a very brief intro that primary prevention is a public health framework for looking at social change and addressing health disparities in different communities. So this little graphic comes from Veto Violence, which is a CDC program.
Encouraging work at all levels prevents sexual violence. Below is a blue graphic with overlapping ovals radiating to the right. The smallest oval is individual, then relationship, community, and societal.
And basically what primary prevention says is that it's possible to prevent violence and other kinds of health disparities or social harm through a variety of avenues. And in public health, we talk about being able to, for example, prevent sexual violence through boosting individual protective factors and reducing individual risk factors. And then similarly for relationship, community, and societal level changes. So an example of, since this webinar is focused around disability, individual protective factors might be an individual who has a history of doing personal advocacy, you know, that they've built those skills around doing personal advocacy.
Individual strategies may include learning attitudes and behaviors that support equality and respect.
Relationship protective factors might be things like having either family members, friends, or even caretakers for people who have disabilities that are affirming, are used to working with people with disabilities, and also respect the agency of the person that they're advocating with.
Relationship strategies may include implementing bystander intervention training, mentoring skill-based programs for high school students, helping parents identify and address violent attitudes and behaviors in kids.
So another way to say this in public health is safe, stable, nurturing relationships. A lot of times we talk about that as a protective factor for youth and adults, but similarly having obviously safe, stable, nurturing relationships in adulthood is also a very important protective factor for violence or against violence. And then at the community level, for example, a community protective factor might be something like having accessible walkways that are not, disintegrated, or having hallways that are appropriately large so that people can speak or communicate with sign language. Basically just creating community space that's actually accessible to people based on the way that they move through the world.
Community strategies may include implementing social marketing, campaigns addressing gender, sexuality, and sexual violence norms, identifying hotspots and unsafe areas on school campuses to increase monitoring.
And then societal level changes might be protective factors might be, for example, if people were holistically valued in our daily social norms, regardless of their ability to work or contribute to the workforce.
Societal strategies may include promoting norms, policies, and laws supporting bystander skill building, healthy sexuality, and positive relationships.
So that's just a very quick rundown. Obviously, there's similar like risk factors or things that might contribute negatively or increase the likelihood that someone might experience violence. But I want to use protective factor examples for this simply because very often we emphasize very heavily risk factors and don't also talk about what are the protective factors that we can work to enhance people's safety and well-being. And then since a lot of these webinars are focused on the idea of disability justice, I wanted to make sure that we had an understanding of what that phrase means. So the definition that I'm using is actually a quote from Mia Mingus, who's an incredible disability advocate who does a lot of different amazing movement building if you're not familiar with her. But anyway, so her definition of disability justice is: disability justice is a multi-issue political understanding of disability and ableism, moving away from a rights-based equality model and beyond just access to a framework that centers justice and wholeness for all disabled people and communities. So this is important because Mia is not saying that we shouldn't also focus on policy and rights issues, but that to create a a just environment and world for people with many different disabilities, we need to focus much more holistically and comprehensively on every way that people are impacted by ableism as we move through the world. So some ways that I wanted to make this really concrete for people and thinking about what disability justice looks like might be, like I mentioned earlier, people actually being valued simply for their humanity, regardless of their ability to be, quote, productive or contribute to our economy. In other words, somebody who is unable to work is not less valuable as a person than somebody who is able to work multiple jobs or something like that. Another really important facet of disability justice is removing the, sorry about that. Another facet of disability justice is ending the attempts or mentality that disability should be cured. For example, I am autistic and I have no desire to not be autistic. This is an important part of who I am, and I think it actually gives me a very unique and valuable perspective that often maybe people who are allistic or not autistic might not have. Having part of disability justice would be actually celebrating and not just a tolerance of diverse ways of being. And then, of course, that people will actually have equitable access to healthcare, employment, housing, water, all of their basic needs being met, whatever that might look like for individuals. People being believed to know their own needs, bodies, and convey their own narratives. So very often, it's very common for people with disabilities to either be assumed to not be able to convey their own needs or to be assumed not to know their bodies. Very often when people with disabilities report violence, they aren't believed to be able to convey the harm that they experienced. And all of these things and these norms around not supporting people with disabilities directly contributes to the violence that they are disproportionately at risk for experiencing. Another facet of this that's I could probably spend an entire webinar on, but I just want to bring up is the idea around quality of life. Very often, especially medical fields, people talk about quality of life, and what they're basing that on is an abled and healthy idea of a positive quality of life, instead of basing it on people's individual understandings of their quality of life. So for example, I have a friend who needed a feeding tube and several doctors tried to convince them not to get that because they told them, quote, that it would decrease their quality of life to have a feeding tube, when in fact it significantly alleviated a lot of other health issues that they were having and allowed them to have much more stable access to nutrition. And so whenever doctors feel that, or medical folks or people who don't have the same health or disability issues think that it's acceptable to define other people's quality of life, that's harmful. People should be able to decide what improves or decreases their quality of life for themselves. And then the last bit about disability justice that's really important, particularly in thinking about violence prevention, is the idea of universal design. So this is the idea that was created through disability advocacy, that any kind of space, organizational practice, or anything else that we're doing at the community or organizational level especially, it should be designed intentionally to support access for those with least access. So that means, making sure that your community organization actively works with people who maybe are undocumented or people who have mobility disabilities and things like this. Who has the least access to your space and to your services, and how can you design those space and services to intentionally prioritize their access, because by doing so you give the greatest level of access to the most number of people. I wanted to do a very brief intro to disability community language. So this is important because language matters, and the language that we use with each other and in service provision can have a really large impact in people's access to those services and those spaces. So there's a few words I put in quotes here that I am calling master effect language. I'm sorry, I totally cannot remember who I learned this from, but the idea is that when people are referred to with these words like crips, gimps, robot, or crazy, These are slurs, especially when they're used by able, neurotypical, or healthy people against people who are disabled or have disabilities, people who are neurodivergent, or people who are chronically ill. Sometimes some of these words are used by people with different disabilities to kind of take away power from the ways that they've been harmed with this language. And we don't have time to go into all that, but I want to give language to say that that's called in-group language. And regardless of your familiarity with how people might use these words, they should not be used in service settings. And if you have questions, you're welcome to ask more about this type of language at the end of the webinar, or feel free to contact any of us later. Probably the more mainstream debate around language is the difference between using descriptive or person-first language. So descriptive language might be saying a disabled person.
Sometimes perceived as reclaimed language, or language only to be used by PWD. Other times perceived as language to actively combat cure culture.
Person-first language might be saying people with disabilities.
Sometimes perceived as not rejecting cure culture.
So even in disability communities, there's a lot of disagreement about what language should be used and what shouldn't be. And so I would just generally say that the most widely accepted language is person-first language, people with disabilities. But this varies a lot based on your age and generation, other community identities, and even how visible the person's disabilities are. There's a lot of history with both of these. Okay, the last thing I just want to mention in this intro section about primary prevention and disability justice is that there's a lot of ways in which these two movements converge, and then there's also some other ways in which they diverge. So convergences or ways that they intersect really well is that both primary prevention and disability justice seek to create holistic wellness for people. They both attempt to prevent harm by changing structures, and they both rely on changes to social determinants of health. Or another way to think about this, like we talked about earlier, is, addressing, making sure people have equitable access to healthcare. Access to healthcare is a social determinant of health and well-being. And so both disability justice and primary prevention say those things are important for people to have access to in the ways that they need. Some ways that they kind of differ or compete a little bit is that often primary prevention is a little bit more focused on policy change or legal change. Disability justice includes policy change, but it's usually not necessarily the highest goal or perceived as the thing to have the greatest impact in terms of creating holistic wellness for people with disabilities. And then another way that they differ is that a lot of folks in disability justice say that sometimes primary prevention can be implemented in a way that supports cure ideology. So the reason this is important to consider is that, for example, primary prevention says, how can we prevent violence from ever occurring? How can we prevent health disparities from ever occurring? But sometimes people consider disabilities as health disparities. And while this is a very complicated topic, a lot of people who have disabilities are very happy to have their disability and to exist and move through the world in the way that their body functions. And so it's important that we make sure that if we're talking about primary prevention and disability justice, that there is a lot of deliberate effort to make sure that we aren't saying that disabilities should all be eradicated, because it's very similar to saying that people with disabilities should not exist, right?
Example, disability justice has very explicit delineations between health and wellness.
And then the last thing I want to just mention is an example of this is a lot of times in public health language, we talk about disability and race as risk factors for sexual violence. In reality, what people are trying to say, I think, is that the ways that people of color, people with disabilities, marginalized genders and sexualities, the way that these marginalized folks are systematically removed from having access to structural power is a risk factor. But simply having an identity itself is not a negative, and it shouldn't be discussed or perceived as being negative or inherently a risk factor or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and stop. I think I'm done. And I think next we have Cierra, and I'm going to let Cierra move us along.
The screen switches to a default blank screen with microphone pattern.
All right, thank you so much, Sky. Up next, we have Cierra Olivia Thomas-Williams, who is the prevention specialist at ICADV. Cierra, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter now.
Intersections, or how power is operating.
And I'm unmuted, so does that mean people can probably hear me right now? Fantastic. I'm just going to do a check real quick to see if my slideshow advances when I want it to, and it is not. Not sure what to do about that. Oh, it went, okay.
The screen switches back to the default screen.
Whoa. Can you see that? Okay. Show my screen. Sorry. Okay. Hello.
The previous slide reappears.
Thanks for joining us today, everybody. I'm Sierra Olivia Thomas-Williams of the Miwok of the El Dorado Rancheria. That's a band of Sierra Miwoks. I also work at Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I'm a prevention specialist there, and we provide training and technical assistance in Indiana to domestic violence programs. But my work is funded through the the Indiana State Department of Health to work on sexual violence prevention. So I'm really excited about this collaboration over the next year. And what I wanted to do with my time this morning, right now, this afternoon, is to really take us down a path of the past, because I think that the past is always present and we tend to forget it. And so one of the ways that I want to do that is by discussing the Black feminist framework of intersectionality, which works to make visible power and how it works to create and increase disparities between groups. This making visible of power can be the first step toward allowing us to address and move power in our work toward resistance and restoration. So at ICADV, we believe power imbalances are the taproot of multiple forms of violence. Some people and communities have unearned advantages, while some communities are allowed and forced even to get sicker. Some bodies are valued while others are devalued and left to die. And with all the messages in recent popular culture about race and racism and sexism and sexual harassment, we really wanted to ensure that the information that we share over the next year about disability justice and primary prevention of sexual and other forms of violence brings to focus or to light the ways in which power is operating at multiple levels to ensure the continued status quo, and the dichotomous way in which legal remedies often empty the complexity of the situation, where well-meaning people like us, in fact, make exceptions to get further along in the system, and how people with disabilities are disproportionately at risk for experiencing harm because of the exceptions that we've made. So there are clear intersections of racism, sexism, and ableism in the earliest United States laws preceding the actual legal beginning of Indian removal. And those are Indian land laws, which were foundational to the guardianship laws that today strip some people with disabilities of decision-making and other rights. So public health and population health is always and has always been imbricated in the project of nation building, and legal precedents in colonial US shaped our ideas today about valuable bodies and disposable bodies. That history today still impacts access and opportunity. So before I dive into what I want to talk about in terms of history, I want to provide a helpful lens that participants on this webinar in the field of violence prevention may have heard of, but perhaps not necessarily the attendees in this webinar from the disability services and advocacy field, and that's intersectionality. Intersectionality is a frame that makes visible power over mechanisms that are at work to impact populations.
Lens, frame, viewpoint of intersectional harm, historical, generational reach, can see difference, therefore address it.
Kimberly Crenshaw is the coiner of the term intersectionality. In 1991, she wrote about intersectionality as a Black feminist analysis of the limitations of legal equality and of single-axis social movements like the movement to end violence against women, which meant often ending violence for white women. And Crenshaw, in that foundational piece, also critiques how race studies still often only looks at systemic racial violence against men and boys. And so this intersectionality frame really is a way of looking at the different ways of relationality, humans to the environments, humans to humans, the social context of power relations. It allows us to keep the complexity as we strive for social justice and remove inequities. And so really intersectionality is a lens or a frame, a viewpoint to think about intersectional harm that is historically rooted in generational reach of systems oppression through politics, legal precedent, and representation.
How is power operating here? On the left is an illustration of a stick figure in a wheelchair surrounded by arrows pointing to the labels education, sexuality, ability, age, gender, ethnicity, culture, language, class, and race.
So intersectionality as a framework allows us to look at the limitations of legal rights, and that's often called equality, and asks us to think about justice in terms of restoration. So the framework rejects this single axis politics, like, for example, if somebody is pursuing a discrimination case, they can be discriminated by race or discriminated by gender, but never both. Legally, our system cannot handle the multiplicity of multiple forms of discrimination. And so what intersectionality helps us see is that these forms of discrimination are not universal. They're very unique at the unique intersections of people's different identities. And I really love how Dean Spade, who is a trans legal scholar and activist, writes about this in the piece Intersectional Resistance and Law Reform. Dean Spade writes, intersectionality can bring to attention the violences of legal and administrative systems that articulate themselves as neutral, but are actually sites of gendered racialization processes that produce the nation state. Patricia Hill Collins called this a matrix of domination or interlocking systems of oppression, where those identity categories are sort of locked down how a person is viewed as. And a Dutch author who writes in disability studies about power argues power is rendered visible at these intersections, and goes on to explain that Black neurodivergent trans women will fundamentally have a different experience in the world than white neurodivergent trans women will.
On the right is an illustration of a four-way crossroads with the left road labeled homophobia, the right road labeled transphobia, and at the intersection is a signpost with several directions: xenophobia, racism, heterosexism, sexism, ableism, classism. Beneath is the attribution, the urgency of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw, TED Women 2016, link available in video notes.
And so what I really like about this framework is that it forces us to recognize the importance of moving away from individual rights and individual harms. Those are important, but we need to recognize population level systems that distribute harm and violence. And so really, I can take a look at how power is operating at any point in time in history and identify how it's a problem. We can jump into it at any time, but I find this time period in United States history to be really interesting. So what you're looking at is a map from a very long time ago, probably the late 1800s.
The map is of the U.S., from the Mississippi River west to the Pacific Ocean. The eastern half is broadly labeled Louisiana Territory, and the western half is Oregon Territory, with Mexico to the south. From St. Louis, the Missouri River extends northwest, while the Rio Grande extends southwest.
Like around 1807, this map shows the United States really kind of the uncharted territory that's west of what is now the Mississippi River. At that time in history, indigenous people were being pushed west further and further. And the text bubble is covering the territory that would have had my ancestors in it, the Sierra Miwoks. So I point this out to draw the connections among the many ways in which early nation state worked to divide the nation between the abled and the disabled, the superior and the inferior, through essentializing categories that are dichotomous and pitted against each other. So what I want to draw your attention to really is the first bullet point on this slide. In 1807, some of the first Indian contract laws made indigenous adults children. And the decision of the court says that Indians are under a state of dependence and imbecility on the part of the Indians, and that correspondent claim upon us for protection arising out of the superiority of our condition. So essentially, the judges were basically saying we need to save these stupid people. That's how it translates in my brain.
Weak, dependent, and mental debasement made Indians notoriously unfit to make a contract, sell land, be witnesses in court, or raise children. Infants, idiots, lunatics, spendthrifts, and married women are among the undamente, mentally deficient, and inops concilii, unfit. Rosen, 2007, page 62.
And at the bottom of the words, you can see that married women are taken up in this children category. This really reflects the superiority of the white, male, able, heterosexual body and mind, specifically in relationship to the land and citizenship. And this is something that we often forget about when we think about race and racism, or ableism, in fact, that indigenous people were forced to become diasporic as a result of being made legally children. In 1830, that's when the Indian Removal Act was signed in by Congress, and then it became legal to actually forcibly remove people. So what is going on here is we see the establishment of today's guardianship law as we know it. This law states who is capable of raising children, owning land, entering into legal contracts, having rights, and in fact being citizens. So this is the birth of the guardianship law that so many people with disabilities lose their rights to today. So in this law actually paved the way for mass incarceration of people of color and people with disabilities in institutions. And before I talk a little bit about institutionalization, I just wanted to show you this slide to talk about the risks that social isolation poses to people.
On the left is a picture of a black prison door with a small barred window. The door is open a crack, with light peeking through. Social isolation leads to loneliness. Loneliness is deadly. Social isolation increases the risk for perpetuation or victimization of sexual assault.
In this slide, we have a former Surgeon General saying that loneliness, which can result from social isolation, is so dangerous it can impact your body like smoking cigarettes can. And I really like what Vivek Murthy says. If we focus on rebuilding our connection with each other, we can have a real impact on our ability to dialogue and to come together and solve tough problems.
Research compares loneliness to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We evolved to be social beings, and when we are alone, we are in a state of stress. That can lead to higher inflammation, which leads to disease. Loneliness also affects how we do at school and work.
And I really appreciate that outlook. And social isolation through institutionalization or other means is dangerous for so many reasons. So that's the present, but we can use that frame to explore the past a little bit. And so what I'm doing here with this slide is really showing you the different forms of institutionalized social isolation across time. And I think this institutionalization is an isolating mechanism. This is deliberate isolation. It's population control through legal means, where some populations are redistributed in the service of others into containers for free labor, for example, or for medical experimentation. These three kinds of institutions are linked through their population control mechanisms. So the first institution that I'm telling you about is the asylum, or you might call that these days a state hospital for people with developmental disabilities, but also the poor and that's distressed. I changed that word. It would have said mentally ill.
1848, Dorothea Dix, via male advocate, lobbied for total separation of people with disabilities on 5 acres, passed both houses of Congress. Vetoed by President number 14, Franklin Pierce. Attributed to parallels in time, link available in notes.
And, you know, early on in American history, we had people literally trying to segregate people into places like reservations. And you can see in this slide that the president vetoed this idea early on, but it just changed and became the state hospital. A little bit after that bill failed to go forward because it was vetoed by Pierce, we have the mass abductions of indigenous children and who were put into religious boarding schools. And this really came from the fact that it was really costly to go to war. And so in 1855, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs explained that it's just cheaper to educate the Indians than to fight them. So what they did,
1869 to 1870.
What the United States did is they awarded contracts to churches to create schools to keep indigenous children from using their own language and their own names, as well as from practicing their own religion and culture. They were given new Anglo names, clothes, and haircuts, and told that they had to abandon their former ways of life.
Andrea Smith, link available in video notes.
This happened to my grandmother, and she wasn't a woman who talked very often, or very much to me, but what I do know is that we don't know what her name was. She has a biblical name of somebody who is really not great, a woman who was not great. And they gave her the birthday of October 31st because she was a particularly evil child, they say. And I believe that these are connected to today's mass incarceration of people of color. And in that green box, I just provide you with just one fact from the NAACP, where we have a large portion of men of color and women of color who are incarcerated.
Though African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 32% of the U.S. population, they comprise 56% of all the incarcerated people in 2015. NAACP, link available in video notes.
So you're actually going to see this slide from Jane. So I'm just going to move on to this slide and tell you a little bit more about what happens inside institutions and what happens as a result of generational isolation and poverty and early death.
Disproportionate sexual violence across the lifespan for people with cognitive disabilities. On the left, under the heading Childhood, children with disabilities 3 times as likely as those without disabilities to experience sexual abuse. VERA 2013. In the middle, under the heading Adolescence, no YRBS data that we know of. Children and adolescents with intellectual and mental health disabilities experience 4.6 times greater risk of sexual violence. VERA 2013. On the right, under the heading Adulthood, women with disabilities are more than twice as likely to be sexually assaulted by an intimate partner, 20% versus 8%. CDC. Men with disabilities experience higher rates of sexual violence than their counterparts. VERA Institute of Justice 2017. People with disabilities are 12 times as likely to experience sexual assault as people without disabilities. Shapiro, 2018.
Sorry, just one second. Okay. The function of these early U.S. land, legal, mental, and public health policies worked to render some people less valuable. And this same reasoning shapes guardianship laws today. And what this does is it uses the power of oppressive racism and sexism to ensure the continued disadvantage of some people and ensure the advantage of others. From 1930 to the 1970s, poor Black men, for example, were provided housing and general care to participate in a syphilis study at the Tuskegee Institute, where men were withheld from treatment for syphilis by public health officials who may not have had informed consent, but the benefit, and I put that in quotes, the benefit of the unethical torture of Black men administered by public health officials is the knowledge of the untreated course of syphilis as a sexually transmitted infection on the human body. And some other forms of nationally sanctioned sexual violence includes the mass sterilization of Puerto Rican women in the US territory of Puerto Rico from 1900 to 1975. That was the year I was born. Women were sterilized en masse by public health officials for free and without their informed consent using United States public health funding. So this eugenics-based science shaped not only indigenous people's access to the land of their ancestors, but in creating a class of dependent children, it took control of the sexual and reproductive freedom of women of color and people with disabilities in the United States. As many as 25% of Native American women between ages of 15 and 44 years old were sterilized by the 1970s. So what's ironic here, and not in a good way, is Puerto Rican women, like all American women, and Native American women, like all American women, were withheld access of forms of birth control beyond sterilization until the mid-20th century, but those very women actually participated in the 1955 contraceptive trials for the pill, and some of them even died. But now we have one of the most widely used forms of birth control for women across the nation. So brown bodies were good, again, enough to experiment on for the good of the nation, and so too were disabled bodies. So in the 1960s, when our current president was in his 20s, hepatitis was another infection that spreads through sexual contact. It was studied on institutionalized children and adults with disabilities in the Willowbrook School, where 100% of the residents contracted hepatitis within 6 months of their stay. So each of these practices were enabled by systemic ableist dehumanization of indigenous people, Black people, and people with intellectual disabilities, which privileges able, white, heterosexual, cisgender people. So when I say cisgender, I mean people whose gender aligns with the sex assigned at birth. So ableism really works with racism and sexism and transphobia as power over systems that enable discrimination at the highest levels. And so really we have reproductive health advances because people with color and people with disabilities were tortured and died. Trying to advance my slide and it is not cooperating. So I left it up on these statistics so you can see the disproportionality between what we know and what we don't know about people with disabilities. This slide also, I'm trying to advance and it's not going.
The slide changes to the blank screen.
Okay, advance.
The previous slide returns.
Advance. It's not advancing. Okay. Well, that's all right. I had another slide in there that would show you the disparities between employed people without disabilities and employed people with disabilities, and it would just show you a great disparity across multiple categories, but I can't make my my slide go. So I'm almost out of time, and what my last slide is supposed to show you is something hopeful because I've shared with you a lot of doom and gloom. So what I wanted to end on was that restoration and healing is possible. It's very possible. We need community support and connectedness. Those things protect us against multiple forms of violence, including child maltreatment, youth violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, elder abuse, and suicide. So I don't want to leave us on a negative or lead into Jane's time. So I just want to emphasize really that
after a blank screen, the restoration and healing slide has appeared. There is a black and white illustration of 4 plants with shared roots in different stages of growth. On the left is barely a bud. Next is a fully grown plant with long, thin leaves. Next, the fully grown plant is flowering, and the last plant has been cut down to just the stem.
That safe, stable, nurturing environments and relationships are important for everybody's wellness. And I share that it's a framework from, oh, can people see that now? Oh, thank you. It's a framework from the Centers for Disease Control, and it is called the Essentials for Childhood. And I share it with you, and Sky shared it with you. I think that this is really important because it can make power relations visible. And we shared it not because we think people with disabilities are children, but because the safe, stable, nurturing environments and relationship framework is about wellness for the vulnerable. And all people are vulnerable. So in the field of services and advocacy for people with disabilities, this endeavor that they're going through right now towards supported decision-making by the disability field is building the process of interconnectedness and connectedness across the social ecology, which really prevents multiple forms of violence. But I think one thing that I'll end on today is that unless the field of disability services and advocacy is willing to address power over mechanisms and move those power over toward power with and power to affect social change, we really are not going to make a great deal of headway. We have to deal with power over. So we want to wrap the webinar today later after Jane talks with a discussion from a cross-disability panel of people who will talk about those wonderful things that I just mentioned. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Cierra. Up next, I would like to introduce our third and final speaker, Jane Harlan Simmons, who is a research associate with the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community at Indiana University.
A smiling portrait of Jane Harlan Simmons. She is a middle-aged white woman with salt and pepper gray hair in a bob down to her neck, parted to frame her left cheek and tucked behind her right ear. She wears a gray jacket over a black and white striped shirt. She has a yellow flower brooch.
Jane, I'm going to go ahead and make you our presenter.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation today. I'll be talking about the era of institutions in Indiana disability history. And if you cannot hear me, I hope you'll communicate that to the organizer. I'll proceed assuming that everybody can hear me. So this presentation is based upon work done for the Indiana Disability History Project. I'll be talking more about the project later on in the webinar and showing you some of our new website.
Early Indiana institutions in the eugenics movement.
First, 2 things about the presentation. I've made a choice not to change a few words, and I know we've talked a little about language already today. Words that were used in the past but might be considered offensive today. In looking at history, we need to get an accurate understanding of how people with disabilities were viewed at a particular time. You'll notice that many of the institutions' names change over time. Also, we'll be discussing the abuse of people in institutions as part of this topic. There will be 2 videos. One has former state officials describing general instances of mistreatment they witnessed. And the second video is a disturbing news report with footage of abusive treatment shown. So I'll let you know when those are coming up. Right from the start, institutions were woven into the fabric of Indiana's founding as a state.
A circular seal titled The Seal of the State of Indiana, 1816. It shows a verdant scene of a bison jumping over a fallen tree, a lumberjack cutting at a tree with a hatchet, and a sun rising over 3 overlapping hills.
In 1816, the original Constitution provided for 1 or more farms to be an asylum for those persons who, by reason of age, infirmity, or other misfortunes, may have a claim upon the aid and beneficence of society. So the forerunners of institutions for Hoosiers with disabilities in the 19th century became county poorhouses or poor farms. In 1848, Indiana Hospital for the Insane which was later named Central State Hospital, opened in Indianapolis.
In 1879,
The Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children in Fort Wayne was one of the earliest institutions in the nation for children with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities.
there's a black and white photograph of Fort Wayne State School, an elegant 3-story building with many arched windows on all sides, tall triangular rooftops with spires, and the central tower is 5 stories high.
Those institutions I just mentioned were what we call custodial, providing for basic needs at best. Also around this time, state-supported schools opened that were educational rather than custodial. The Indiana Institute for the Education of the Blind is still open today, has a slightly different name.
A black and white photo shows the Indiana State School for the Blind, 1928. It is a 5-story cube of a building with an octagonal tower on top and a large portico over the front entrance supported by 4 Greek-style columns.
We also still have what became of the Indiana School for the Deaf. It was the first state school in the U.S. to offer a free education to students with hearing impairments.
The Indiana School for the Deaf was originally the Indiana Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb.
The view of people with disabilities in that first state constitution was a little more positive than what evolved at the end of the 19th century. People labeled as feeble-minded were increasingly seen as a burden and a threat to society. The eugenics movement was based on a theory of better breeding and human improvement. It was thought to be grounded in science. That science has been discredited. Eugenic ideas were adopted by Hoosier politicians, educators, and reformers, so the ideas were pretty mainstream. They were actually seen as being progressive. As far as eugenics, Indiana has an unfortunate distinction. In 1907, it became the first state to legislate mandatory sterilization for the insane, feeble-minded, or epileptic, so to speak. Victims of eugenic legislation over the following 6 decades were largely institutionalized people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. The Indiana plan, as it was known, was later adopted by other states. These laws reflected ideas that were the basis for the eugenic policies in Nazi Germany.
A black and white portrait of eugenicist Harry Clay Sharp, a prison physician in Jeffersonville, Indiana. He's a bald white man with a round face and small wire-rimmed glasses. He wears a suit and tie. The subtitle reads, First Eugenic Sterilizer.
In the mid-20th century, institutions in the U.S. were bursting at the seams. Peonage, or involuntary servitude, was a common practice in state-operated institutions. Unpaid resident labor was an essential aspect of institutional economies. In Indiana, farming operations and other unpaid work were a way of life at the Newcastle and Muscatatuck state institutions.
In the top right is a black and white photo of several white women packing cabbage into wooden crates.
As an example, Dorothy Stewart was admitted to Muscatatuck State Hospital as an 18-year-old in 1950. She'd had a brush with the law. She was put to work with jobs later done by paid staff, including working with, quote, lower functioning residents and minding babies in the nursery. She talked about her experience. She said, back then the clients were helpers. We helped take care of them. The Fair Labor Standards Act was supposed to protect employees of public residential institutions. It was never really enforced for institutionalized people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. However, institutions were afraid of lawsuits and started eliminating those unpaid jobs. Farming operations using resident labor were phased out at Indiana institutions such as Newcastle and Muscatatuck State Hospitals by 1969. Part of the reason institutions were filling up was that doctors advised parents to put their children away in these places.
Family separations. In the first half of the 20th century and beyond, doctors counseled parents of children with disabilities to place their daughter or son in the custody of a state-run facility. On the left is a black and white photo captioned, Tommy Hancock, later institutionalized at Muscatatuck, with a nurse in 1946. The smiling white woman with curly hair and a white nurse's uniform is holding the baby in front of a hospital.
One of our interviewees, Sandra Blair, had a son who was 7 when he entered Muscatatuck State School in the early 1960s. Sandra recalled the doctor said to her, he said, "I'm going to paint you a very black picture. You'll miss him, you'll remember, but he won't." She said, "I felt like I was burying him." Sandra's son would receive family visits, but it was not uncommon for these placements to involve a total break in family ties. In the 1960s and 70s, revelations emerged in national media about the neglect and abuse of institutional residents. In Indiana, as elsewhere, mistreatment in institutions included verbal and emotional abuse, physical and chemical restraints. One of our interviewees, Erica Studerman, recounted visiting her older brother at Central State Hospital when she was a child in the 1960s. She said, "I remember him coming out through the door of this big brick edifice because we were never allowed to go inside. And he had bruises all over his arms. And he had scabs. I just knew that something evil was going on in there." So I'm going to show you a video with former state officials talking about the various types of restraints used in Indiana institutions. And if this troubling content is something you prefer not to hear, you can mute the volume or you can return in about 3.5 minutes.
A YouTube video plays. Restraint used in state institutions. Randy Kriebel, an older balding white man with gray hair on the sides, wearing rectangular glasses and a blue vest.
I mean, people, 40 years ago were locked in isolated areas, what we called timeout rooms. We used everything from rollerboards to four-way restraints to restraint chairs that were in the middle of an open area where other people were around them. So not only were they restrained, but they, it was undignified to be out there, maybe even unsafe if, another resident would attack them or something. Chemical restraints, was prevalent. Medication authorized for other than a psychiatric diagnosis.
There were some folks, 2 ladies that I can think of.
Ruth Stanley, an older white woman with dark gray short hair, wearing a zebra print sweatshirt.
That started at Newcastle when they were maybe 5, 6, 7 years old with heavy doses of psychotropic medications, and they were not improved. When they were in Central 20, 30 years later,
we had one individual, I believe he's in a waiver now.
Sue Beecher, a middle-aged white woman with a round face and permed graying blonde hair, wears an orange jacket with colorful cat print scarf.
Who was smart enough to kind of get out of the straitjacket and escape, and so he would be running across grounds with, the straps kind of flapping. The ammonia sprays were used, especially on the children's units, and I remember being appalled about that even then. But the psychologist, of course, would say, well, this is what is needed. The straitjackets, the young man that I'm thinking of and had pretty severe self-injurious behaviors. And so that was one of their behavioral methods of trying to keep him from injuring himself. But he spent a lot of time in that, which, and again, he got smart enough, he could undo the straps and get out of the straitjacket, kind of a Houdini thing. And so a lot of his day was spent in restraint, and straitjackets are restraint. You're not able to use your arms, that's the idea, so that he couldn't do the self-abusive behaviors. The ammonia spray, and I can remember this pretty vividly, and I remember a couple of the psychologists and I were friends. It was simply a watered down spray bottle with some ammonia in it, which would be quite aversive. I mean, having ammonia sprayed in your face, which was where they would spray that, would be pretty aversive. I mean, ammonia's got a terrible smell to it, and then it can be corrosive. And again, this was also before regulations per se, so they would write behavior plans, or maybe not even, I mean, staff could just use that when they felt they needed to use it. My understanding was that it had to be some pretty severe behavior. And again, I worked in an outpatient clinic, so my time on the units was minimal. But you know, it's interesting that when I was on the units, I would see that. So my speculation would be that it was used pretty frequently. And knowing how Newcastle worked, my guess is it was used indiscriminately by staff. It was used whenever they felt maybe they were in danger or the person was not behaving or out of control. So I'm not sure that it was very well organized. I like to think that the regulations now within group homes and to a lesser extent the waiver regulations really prevent that kind of thing from just being used, you know, indiscriminately anytime. But the ammonia spray, especially on the children, that was used in the children's units more so than the adult units.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here.
A newspaper clipping titled "Governor Vows Changes at Newcastle" is accompanied by a grainy black and white photo of two older white men in suits walking with a crowd behind them.
Eventually, these abusive conditions ended with closures of the institutions. Their populations had been decreasing and social attitudes were evolving to the idea that people with disabilities belong in their communities. The work of disability rights advocates absolutely contributed to these changes. So in 1994, Central State Hospital was shut down following a series of suspicious deaths. Newcastle State Developmental Center closed in 1998, a year after a television broadcast showed hidden camera footage of employees abusing residents. Muscatatuck and Fort Wayne developmental centers closed in 2005 and 2007.
On the right is a photo of a roadside sign that says "Welcome to Muscatatuck State Developmental Center."
And this was after a Department of Justice lawsuit alleged that conditions violated the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. So in a second video I'd like to show you is a news report about the Newcastle expose. Wish TV of Channel 8 out of Indianapolis secretly filmed resident abuse by employees inside the State Developmental Center. The station broadcast their footage as part of a series of 7 investigative reports. These were aired on the evening news in May 1997. I'm going to show you the first of these broadcasts. It may be difficult to watch for some. I think I'm going to end it at 4 minutes since we're running a little behind time. So if you decide you'd like to tune out, you can rejoin us in about 4 minutes.
The screen switches to a YouTube video titled "Newcastle Developmental Center Investigation." The hidden camera footage in this video is black and white, blurry, and shot from odd angles. Part 1. An adult grabs a child by the shoulders.
Watch that damn television now. Watch the stall.
Staff are sitting on a table.
If you two don't hush, I'm gonna sew your lips together.
Harsh language and harsh actions all taking place at a facility where your tax dollars are supporting.
2 larger adults are taping up a seated person's hands. At the news desk, we see Debbie Knox, a white woman with a brown bob and purple jacket, and Micah Hearn, an older white man with gray hair and a suit.
Good evening. It's 11 o'clock. An exclusive I-Team investigation has uncovered shocking treatment of residents at the Newcastle State Developmental Center.
We see an aerial view of the facility, which is laid out like a wide H.
The center is home to 165 Hoosiers who receive treatment for mental illness and retardation. It comes under scrutiny in recent months because of alleged abuse of residents. I-Team reporter Anna Werner joins us with details of an undercover investigation.
They turn to Anna Werner, a white woman with brown hair and a red blazer.
Anna?
Well, Debbie and Mike, what you're going to see may conjure up some of your darkest fears of institutional living. The language you'll hear is cruel and profane. And worst of all, our hidden cameras show this verbal and physical abuse coming from some of the center's staff.
Sit on down and stay, or I'll put you in that damn chair and tie your ass up. Is that what you want?
A blurry figure yells at someone seated on a couch.
It sounds a bit like a drill sergeant giving orders.
You can't go out there, the floor's wet. Go sit down.
A staff person in a striped polo shirt grabs a patient by the arm and pushes them to the couch.
But these barked commands are coming from caregivers.
Sit down, don't start.
2 staff manhandle a patient by their arms.
They're the people responsible for the well-being of their mentally disabled patients.
If you don't turn them eyes around, I'm going to turn them around for you.
Our hidden camera investigation at the Newcastle State Developmental Center reveals how residents there are really being treated.
Blurry footage shows groups of people sitting in rooms.
These residents are supposed to be involved in activities that will help them live better lives. But we discovered verbal and physical abuse, and we didn't see much in the way of therapy. A typical scene, our cameras watched residents sit for hours on end in front of the television. This resident dared to move, and this is what he heard.
Don't even think about it, you'll have. Just sit there and enjoy the car show. Let's see, that's about the 3rd warning. You're headed for the tie-up chair.
Watch what happens when he tries to get up again.
She smacks him on the head.
Sit on down and stay, or I'll put you in that damn chair and tie your ass up. Is that what you want? Tie him up. He ain't gonna quit. He's getting wound up.
They're taking him to the tie-up chair. Patients can be restrained in this chair for brief periods of time if they pose a clear danger to themselves or others. But all this young man did was try to get up off the couch. As they strap him in, one of the aides threatens him under her breath, but not so softly that our microphones couldn't pick it up.
Yeah, you don't get try to get me stick to run like a little bastard. I'm just gonna make it hurt you bad.
He's left there, unattended, for 40 minutes.
The staff mill about a room. One sits at a table smoking.
Listen, you'll hear him scream as workers calmly go on about their business. This resident acted up, so he was forced to sit with his head against the wall.
I hope y'all cramped up. Get your head up there against the wall.
The staff is allowed to use this technique with this resident, but only for 5 minutes at a time. This resident sat here for 1 hour and 40 minutes and put up with more of that verbal harassment.
Get up there!
But the worst examples of abuse we caught with our cameras were unmistakable. That's right, that employee just smacked this resident over the head with a clipboard. Watch again.
Have you seen that kind of thing happen?
Anna interviews a silhouetted employee wearing a hoodie and a hat. They are looking at the footage on a TV.
Yes.
Employees we talked to say abuse like that is routine.
How often does something like that happen?
Usually sometime every day.
I think for certain individuals that are not very well liked, they can be in extreme danger. One staff member might have a bad day and decide they're going to take it out on the person they dislike the most.
Previous footage repeats.
Okay, I'm going to cut that off by the last minute. These are all videos that can be watched on our website, and I'll be showing you the website in just a moment. That was, I'm sure you'll agree, an extremely disturbing video.
Indiana institutions, the end of an era.
Indiana eliminated its last state institution for people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities in 2007.
Beneath is a photo of a state landmark plaque erected on a lawn in front of a beige building. It reads 1907 Indiana Eugenics Law. Indiana Supreme Court ruled 1907 law unconstitutional, 1921, citing denial of due process under 14th Amendment. 1927 law reinstated sterilization, adding court appeals. Approximately 2,500 total in state custody were sterilized. Governor Otis R. Bowen approved repeal of all sterilization laws in 1974. By 1977, related restrictive marriage laws repealed.
This was a distinction for our state, as only 9 other states had arrived at this milestone, and 8 of those states were smaller than Indiana. However, many people still remain stuck in nursing homes. As of 2015, we have statistics that there were 1,700 people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities living in Indiana facilities that had 16 beds or more. In the same year that the last institution closed, Indiana marked the 100-year anniversary of its notorious sterilization law. All compulsory sterilization statutes had been repealed back in 1974. So between 1907 and 1974, there had been over 2,000 adults and children forcibly sterilized in Indiana. As part of the centennial, the Indiana legislature adopted a resolution condemning past eugenic abuses, and a historic plaque was unveiled in downtown Indianapolis. I'm going to be switching over to talk a little bit about our project, but I just wanted to remind people, if they have any questions, please make a note of them, and we'll be glad to talk about those at the end. So that's the end of one troubled chapter of Indiana's history. And the Indiana Disability History Project is a project of the Center for Health Equity, which is formerly the Center on Aging and Community. And this center has been working on the exciting initiative for quite a few years now. The project's purpose is to document highlights of the history of people with disabilities in our state. So we're using video and digital technology to record and preserve the memories and the contributions of movement leaders and pioneers with and without disabilities. So this includes community activists, family members, professional service providers, and public officials, among others. The project is funded by the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. As of last December, we have an internet site to house all these wonderful videos. Put it back into slideshow there. So this is an image of our homepage.
The Indiana Disability History Project has a banner across the top showing an older white man being interviewed on camera.
Our collection of oral history videos is the heart of the site, and we now have over 100 of them.
The homepage lists featured items, Karen Vaughn, featured exhibits, the right to work, and who's your advocates.
All the videos are captioned, and they all have text transcripts available as well.
There's a Facebook link that says connect with us, share your story.
So let's take a brief look at what the site has to offer. It's located at www.indianadisabilityhistory.org. I'm going to go over to my browser here.
Indiana History Project.
This is our homepage. We have 4 collections. You've seen a lot of information on the institution's part. We also have our community life collection, our learning collection, which is about education, and our working collection about employment. Our featured items are new things that we've recently added to the collection. This is Senator Tom Harkin. We interviewed him a few months ago about his involvement in the ADA and getting that legislation established. We have featured exhibits, which are one of these 4 mostly, and we have Who's Your Advocates. This is a category where we have video excerpts from project interviewees with intellectual, developmental, or other disabilities who've been active in advocating for themselves and for others. We have a timeline as well. This starts in 1816 and chronicles events important to Indiana disability history on a year-by-year basis, so do check it out. We have a Facebook feed, and we do invite you to visit our Facebook page. We keep it active, and we would love to have you come and like the page and our posts if you're so inclined. Let's look at one of the topic areas, community life, the collection, just to delve another layer down.
The Community Life page shows a profile of Betty Williams with biography on the left and a portrait of a young black woman with short permed hair on the right.
These topic areas all have brief histories in text. You can read those if you like, and they're broken down into chunks with pictures, or not. If you prefer to just watch the videos, we've got some featured videos for each of our collection. You can also see all the other items in a particular collection by clicking on the See Other Items link. And this will show you.
She scrolls down a dense list of articles with titles on the left, a small thumbnail image in the middle, and an excerpt on the right.
A lot of things that are not just videos, but images and documents and other things. One other thing I'd like to point out about the site is the search function. There. So at the top of each page, there's a search box. I'm going to put in assistive technology. Let's see what comes up for that.
As the results for assistive technology appear, the video ends.